Alright, so I've selected a scene from YouTube, and I got it downloaded in an MP4 format from that free YouTube downloader that I provided the link to. So what I want to do now is import that video into Pro Tools and get myself set up to be working on a post-production project. So here's my Pro Tools dashboard and the dialog box when I'm starting a new session. So I'm going to call this Beskid Post-Production. I'm going to store it locally. That's fine for me. I'm not going to create from a template. I'm starting with a blank session because I want you to get the feel for setting this up and why we need to do things a certain way. Okay, so right now my sample rate you see is at 48 kilohertz. That's what we want. Yours will probably look different. That's the only option I have because that coincides with a screen capture program that I use to do all this stuff. But 48 kilohertz is what you're going to need there. And I'm going to recommend moving up to 24-bit. If you remember back to the early days when we first started all this stuff, bit depth has a direct relationship with dynamic range. So we want to have a higher bit depth so we can have a little bit more control over dynamic range. I think that's going to be important for us. So my location is I'm creating this folder on my desktop. You might want to just like work from an external hard drive or something like that, but for now this is going to work for me. It's also useful to just continue working where you start working, just so everything stays in the same place. Okay, so I'm going to create this session. And really, I'm only concerned with the edit window at this point. So I'm going to maximize that view. And I'm going to maybe remove some of the things that I don't necessarily need from this area. As of right now, I'm not working with inserts and I/O and stuff like that, so I might just get rid of those things for the time being. I just want to see track color. Okay, first thing I need to do is import the video, and I guess since we're going to be doing that first, it's worthwhile to say that you cannot actually do any editing to your video once it's in Pro Tools. So, we're shooting for approximately 90 seconds for this project, 90 seconds worth of a scene to recreate the sound design for. You might be just shy of that or a little bit over. That's totally cool. But even so, the video that you downloaded from YouTube might be, much longer than that. Well, we can't actually trim the video in Pro Tools, but what we can do is set a marker to delineate where we're going to begin and end. And that way, every week when you are submitting a portion of your project, all you have to do is highlight the section that you're calling your project and just export those sections. So don't sweat it if it's not exactly 90 seconds or you're expecting to be able to trim it up in Pro Tools, which you just can't do that. Okay, so I'm going to import the long way. File and import video this time. And I know that I stored this on the desktop. So here's my converted MP4 from an animated movie from the 2000s called 9. And I'm going to open it up, and it's going to ask me a few questions. Do I want the audio that was the original audio that was, from the scene? And I do want that. I want to be able to include that as like a resource for myself, so I can go back and listen to what was originally there, and maybe I'm going to mimic some of those things, or I might make some choices to do things a little bit differently even. And I want things to start at the start of the session. That's exactly right. So, okay. And then, so I get the video right away, but then it's going to take, well, where do you want to store the audio from that video? And by default, it's going to be the audio files folder within the larger session folder that was created when we started this. So I don't want to make any other changes. That's correct. So I'm going to say open there. And it's going to churn through and import all that stuff for me. Okay, now you can resize your video window and sort of move it around. Okay, and here's the original audio, so we should be able to go to the beginning of the session and take a listen. Okay, pretty cool. All right, so I've got it successfully in there. You can, if you're not seeing any video on the track here, you can change from, you might be in blocks view, you can change to frames so you can see the little thumbnails. And if you're not seeing the video window at all, it doesn't mean that it's not there, it just means that it's not being revealed. So you would go to window and video to bring that up. And again, you can resize that and place it anywhere you want. All right, I've got my video in there. What I might do is change some of the names. So here's my video, and here's my original audio. Nice. And I'm going to mute that and keep it muted, and maybe even make it smaller than everything else might be. But I know that it's there, and I could always refer to it as necessary. But now I need to set up my Pro Tools session to be actively, ready to work for post-production. And there's going to be some different types of things that we're going to be doing. So we might make some new selections and preferences, basically, that we didn't have before. So I'm going to check my preferences under Setup and Preferences, and just make sure of a couple of these important things that we talked about maybe before, but might have changed. My default track color coding, I want that to match the track type. That's cool. So this color is going to match the waveform. I want to display color when I have different markers. That way, every time I have a specific scene, that little section of the timeline up here between markers will be a specific color. And I want my color coding to match the track color. That's cool. Moving to the Operations tab, I want to automatically create new playlists when loop recording. Remember we used playlists when we were talking about how you can record, a guitar solo multiple different times when you're loop recording or something like that. If you don't have this checked, what will happen when you're using loop record is it'll just keep recording over itself. This way it'll create a new playlist each time, so you'll have a selection of different performances to go through, and that'll come in handy when we're doing dialogue. Okay, the next thing is under processing. I want to make sure that I automatically copy files on import. That way I'm not losing anything, or when I open up my session and maybe I've switched computers or I don't have my hard drive plugged in, it won't be like, hey, you're missing a bunch of files. I want to make sure that that is there. So great. There's all my preferences as far as those deep preferences go. But then in my workspace here, I need to make some changes. And the first thing over here, in the upper left-hand corner, we've only really, these are the different edit modes that Pro Tools offers. We've only really used slip and shuffle. So slip mode allows me to, move an audio region anywhere I want in the timeline, which is great. And shuffle mode allows me only to move it right next to whatever audio sample is next, and when I delete something, it will get shifted over, right? As opposed to in slip mode, if I deleted something, there would be a space left there. When I'm doing post-production, I want to make sure that I'm working in grid mode. And what that does when I turn that on, I'll expand some of these tracks so you can see a little bit better, and zoom in. When I do that, you see that I've actually got this very faint lines here throughout my audio region. That's my grid. If I don't have grid mode on, I lose those. So I want to be working on a grid mode, and that means that my cursor will only move on that grid. The only thing is, what is my grid set as? What determines the size of my grid? Well, sometimes people use this as like tempo or bars and beats for working with music. For us, we want to work with timecode. So we have to start making those changes. We want to be in grid mode here. But then looking at my counter, I want to click this little arrow and make sure that I select timecode as my counting device. Okay. All right. Then what I want to do is make sure that my grid here, looking at this section, I want my grid to be set as timecode. And then looking within that, so timecode selected, and not 1 second at a time. I want every individual frame. So if we're working at a particular frame rate, if you look here underneath the video track, 23.98 frames per second. That's sort of the standard video frame rate because that's how quickly our eyes work. So there are about 24 frames per second that we're dealing with. If I had my grid set for 1 second and I had a sound effect that happened between 1 second in the next, I wouldn't be able to set it and synchronize it exactly in place because I'd be stuck to a grid that is, too large of time frames. So I want to select 1 frame as my grid, and that'll change right here. And right below it, I want to set my nudge value as timecode and 1 frame as well. That allows me to move audio regions in delineations of 1 frame at a time. That's going to be important because we need to sync things exactly with action. So make sure that you're in grid mode, that your counter is displaying timecode, and that your grid and your nudge values are set to timecode and 1 frame. All right, that's going to be hugely helpful for you guys. We need to be working in that sort of way. Okay, so at this point, if you had, say, I was describing earlier, you had a section of video that was longer than the 90 seconds you wanted to actually submit, you would find the spot in your timeline where your project actually is going to begin. And then you'd hit the plus sign where it says markers, and then you'd call that beginning. Right, so you would have a beginning and an end, and this is all just theoretical, right? So it's only if this applies to you. But what you do need to do, regardless, even if the thing that you import is exactly the length that you want it to be, you're going to start going through and watching this, and you're going to say exactly when something happens. You're going to set a new marker there. Exactly when there's like a scene change, right? A location change. You're going to put a new marker and you're going to say, is it exterior street? Okay, exterior street. And then you have to zoom in really close to that, and you have to make sure that it gets exactly right when he steps outside. Right, so there's still inside, and there's outside. So you want to get that exactly correct. And you're going to do that throughout your entire sequence. Every single time there's a location change, because that's going to determine, every time we're in a different location, you're going to have different sounds that define that environment. So for all intents and purposes here, you want to go through and just make sure that every single location change has a marker like that, that makes it obvious that you can easily, if I need to work on the exterior street, I can identify it and quickly get myself there. Then what you would do for this portion of the project, I've got my handy spotting notes list here. What you're going to do is start watching things after you set up your scene location markers and stuff, and you're going to start saying, well, at this many minutes, at 1 minute in, and 0.4 seconds, and 21 frames, let's say that this is a sound effect, and it's lightning crash. Okay. Now, normally I would say, hey, are we going to take this from a library of sounds, or are we going to create this in the field? Since we're doing all this stuff remotely, you're going to be pretty much exclusively using library sounds, so I wouldn't even necessarily fill those out. What you do need to do is get the exact frame, the type of sound effect it is. Is it going to be a background sound or a sound effect, or is it dialogue? What character is doing it? And a brief description of it. Okay, and you're going to be comprehensive about that. So it's going to take you a little while to go through and identify all the different things that you need. Except it's going to be super helpful, because when you get to, say, the first portion of actually creating the audio, you're going to do your background sounds. You can easily go through your spotting notes list, find all the types that are backgrounds, and read your descriptions and know exactly what kind of sounds you're going to have to go and find. This way, it's just a method of organizing yourself to make this easy. So this Sunday, I'm going to be looking for a comprehensive spotting notes list that you're going to submit through Canvas. So make sure that you've got your Pro Tools session set up the way you need it to, that it's saved properly, that you did all the things, making sure we're using grid mode, changing the time code and the grid nudge values, and that you go ahead and set a beginning and an end and markers for all your different scene locations, and then you'll be on track to really get started on this. Thanks for watching. See you next time.